One of the things to think about is no matter how good a job we do at performance management and rating our people, we're going to make errors. Some of these are intentional, some of these are unintentional. Let's look at some of these errors and maybe get a few tips on how we can prevent that from being an issue in performance management. After this video, you'll be able to identify the main types of errors that impact performance reviews, identify strategies for minimizing errors that impact performance reviews. Here's some of the errors that commonly come up in the literature. One is called a central tendency, leniency, and strictness. This is where we sort of we look at everybody and either say, I'm going to be a tough grader, easy grader, or hard grader. These are intentional. The rest are unintentional. Varying standards. We'll talk about that on how we need to be consistent in our standards. We'll talk about recency and primacy effects. This goes into the timing of the behavior and how we evaluate that. We'll talk about rater bias. This is the individual persons or persons who are rating the folks. If they have any biases, they might get in the way. This thing called the horns and halo effect. I'm going to have you think about that and guess what that might be. It's an interesting type of bias. Contrast error. This is where we contrast the wrong things when measuring performance. We'll talk about that. Similar to me, different from me. Pretty self-explanatory, but we'll give an example or two. And finally, sampling error. Much like any other process where we have to take samples, sampling error comes into play. So let's look at these one by one. Central tendency. This is where I'm going to decide, and it's an intentional one, maybe it's as a teacher, that I'm going to give everyone B's, which is central tendency. I might get tough on everybody and be strict and say everyone's getting C's, or I might be nice and lenient and say I'm giving A's. Everyone is rated the same. This is an intentional choice. But the problem with this is it doesn't necessarily reflect the true performance of the individuals. This is a key error. Varying standards. As you can see in my example here, these apples are exactly the same. Why would one get 45 points and the other get 50? This would be based on a sampling or varying standards error. That when we look at a different standard, one could be, say it's a gender bias. One is male, one is female. And I gave varying standards because of that. This obviously is not appropriate use of the performance process. Anybody who should have the same standards used in measuring their performance. Recency and primacy. This is a timing issue. This is sort of a fun one. Primacy issue is when I did something so good right after my review that you haven't forgotten as my manager and you just think I walk on water and everything I do after that gets scrutinized less. The recency effect, or as I lovingly call it in HR, the salary run, that's where I haven't done a really good job and I haven't been meeting my goals necessarily, but I'm going to do really well in the last quarter. And then my manager will look at that and maybe inflate my ratings if they're not well trained at performance management. But the key here is count the whole year, keep good notes, and these things will be eliminated. Rater bias is just that overall I have some sort of prejudice somehow, some way, and in this case, I just happen to like red apples more than green, and I'm always going to rate them higher, even if the quality and the taste is the same. This is one we have to watch. And these tend to be more subliminal and we don't always know we're doing this. So we have to watch, make sure we have good data, good objectives, good standards, and we can minimize many of these biases. Halo and horns effect. This is one where the halo effect is there's something about me initially that you made a generalization from one trait. Maybe I dressed like you. Maybe I had a common interest in a sports team. Maybe you like the same music. We connected on this, and from then on, you had a predisposition to just like me, and that would color your evaluations of me. The horns effect is the opposite. There was something about me you just didn't like. Maybe my name reminded you of somebody. Maybe I came from a neighboring town where we were high school rivals. Whatever it is, it's going to affect how you look at it. This is one that you really have to watch and manage as well. Contrast error. Apples to oranges. This one is a comparison made to other people, not to performance. So an example of this would be, I have a goal of producing 100 widgets, and I meet my goal. So I should meets expectations. My counterpart produced 120 widgets. So all of a sudden, the manager said, Larry did well, but compared to the counterpart, not as good. So you're going to compare me to them. That is not the proper use of the goals and setting. If I meet my goals, I should get meets expectations based on my performance against my goals, not someone else's performance. Similar to me errors. This is one where I compare the employee to myself. Again, it's a little bit like the halo, but there's something that they're very similar to me. They remind me of a young me. Whatever the connection is, there's something about them that I connect with. Or there's something very different from me, so I get a bias and I'm not honest in my assessment of that employee. So again, this is one we'll talk about when we do rater training. Sampling errors. This is where I just don't have enough data. Say 1 + 1 = 3. If that's the data I have, it's going to be inaccurate and insufficient to measure my performance. So we need to make sure we have good data, and when we talk about multi-rater error in training, we really want multi-raters to sort of get rid of that sampling error. Here's a question for you. So let's look at some tips, a couple tips for you. One is, have raters justify their ratings. When you're having rater errors, if you make them justify it and bring data, you will have more likelihood that they will actually have ratings that match the performance. Justify them face-to-face meetings. Have these discussions. So as a manager, when your reviews are done with your folks, have them come in, talk about them, have a dialogue, and have that discussion. You will probably be able to detect some ratings and errors and help them work through that. Have HR monitor across departments and supervisors. In my career, we've done this in every organization I've been with. HR generalists in the area will look at the departments and supervisors and seeing if there's ones that are easy graders, hard graders, varying standards, and really we are sort of the auditors in the QA department. If you don't have an HR department, you certainly, as a manager, can do that with your people. But just make sure there's the old phrase that the apples to apples and oranges to oranges. That will minimize the errors, and from a legal standpoint, it's not a bad advice either.